Chapter 2000. Coy and Gaimard, the naturalists, in company with several officers of the staff, made scientific excursions to Table Mountain and to the famous vineyards of Constantia. Gaimard observes, "The vines that we rode amongst are in the midst of alleys of oak and of pine, and the vine stems, planted at the distance of 4 feet from one another, are not supported by props. Every year the vines are pruned, and the earth about them, which is of a sandy nature, is turned up. We noticed here and there plenty of peaches, apricots, apples, pears, citrons, as well as small plots cultivated as kitchen gardens. On our return, Carlin insisted on our tasting the several sorts of wine which he produces, Constantia properly so called, both red and white, Pontac, Peer and Frontignac. The wine produced in other localities, which is called Cape wine par excellence, is manufactured from a muscatel grape of a dark straw colour, which seemed to me in flavour preferable to the grape of Provence. We have just said that there are 2 sorts of Constantia, the red and the white. They are both produced from muscatel grapes of different colours. People at the Cape generally prefer Frontignac to all the other wines produced from the vintages of Constantia." Exactly a month after quitting the southern extremity of Africa, the Uranie cast anchor off Port Louis in the Isle of France, which, since the treaties of 1815, has been in the hands of the English. The necessity for careening the ship, that it might be thoroughly examined, and the copper sheathing repaired, led to a much longer stay in this port than Freycinet had calculated upon. But our travellers found no cause to regret the delay, for the society of Port Louis fully sustained its old reputation for generous hospitality. The time passed quickly in excursions, receptions, dinners, balls, horse races, and all sorts of festivities. It was, therefore, not without some regret that the French guests bade adieu to a place where they had been received with so much kindness both by their old compatriots and by those who had so lately been their bitter enemies. The stay of the Uranie at the Isle of France had not, however, been sufficiently long to allow Freycinet to investigate many subjects of much interest. But this omission was remedied by the polite readiness shown by some of the leading residents in supplying him with valuable papers on the agriculture of the island, its commerce, its financial position, the industrial pursuits, and the social condition of the people, the correct appreciation of which demanded a more careful and minute examination than a mere passing traveller could possibly give to them. Since the island had come under English administration, it appeared that a number of new roads had been planned out, and a policy of reform had supplanted a benumbing system of routine fatal to all activity and progress. Bourbon was the next place touched at by the Uranie, where the supplies of which the travellers stood in need were to be procured from the government stores. She cast anchor off St. Denis on the 19th July, 1818, remaining in the roadstead of St. Paul until the 2nd August, when she set sail for the Bay of Sharks, on the western shores of Australia. There is little of interest to be noted in connection with the stay at Bourbon, beyond the steady increase of the population, and of trade which had taken place during the century preceding the arrival of the French expedition in 1717. According to Gentle de Barbenize, there were living in the island only 900 free people, amongst whom were no more than 6 white families and slaves. At the last census taken in 1817, these numbers had risen to 14,790 whites, 4342 free blacks, 49,759 slaves, making a total of 68,898 inhabitants. This large and rapid increase must be attributed partly to the salubrity of the climate, but chiefly to the freedom of trade, of which the island had for some time enjoyed the advantage. After a fortunate voyage of 40 days, the Uranie cast anchor at the entrance of the Bay of Sharks on the 12th September. A party was at once dispatched to Dirk Hartog, in order to determine the latitude and longitude of Cape Levelant, and to bring on board the corvette a certain metal plate which had been left there by the Dutch at a remote period, and had been seen by Freycinet in 1801. Whilst this party were away, the 2 alembics were set to work to distill seawater, which was effected so successfully that as long as the vessel stayed there, no other water was drunk but that obtained by this process, and all on board were satisfied with it. On landing, the party sent to Dirk Hartog got a view of the natives, who were armed with javelins and clubs, but had not a vestige of clothing. They, however, refused to have any close communications with the white strangers, keeping themselves at a respectful distance, and not handling any of the presents offered them without a previous careful inspection. Although the Bay of Sharks had been minutely explored at the time of the expedition under Baudin, there still remained a hydrographical gap to be filled up on the eastern side of Hamelin Bay. Accordingly, Duperrey proceeded there to complete the survey of that part of the coast. At the same time, Gaimard, the naturalist, not disposed to rest satisfied with the interviews which as yet he had been able to obtain with the natives of the country, whom the sound of the firearms had summarily dispersed, decided upon penetrating into the interior, to gain some information respecting their mode of life. His companion and himself lost their way, as also did Rich in 1792 upon Knight's Land, where for 3 days they underwent severe sufferings from thirst, not being able to find a single rivulet or spring in the country. The expedition were well pleased when the inhospitable shores of Indracht disappeared from view. They had a pleasant passage in lovely weather, and over an unruffled sea, to the island of Timor, where on the 9th October the Uranie cast anchor in the roadstead of Kupang, and the travellers met with a cordial reception from the Portuguese authorities, but they found that the prosperity which had made the colony an object of wonder and admiration to the French travellers who had visited it with Baudin had passed away. The Raja of Amanaubang, the district where the sandal tree grows in such abundance, who was formerly a tributary prince, was carrying on war to gain independence. The hostilities which were proceeding were not only detrimental to the interests of the colony, but also made it very difficult for Freycinet to purchase the commodities of which he stood in need. Some of the staff set off to pay a visit to the Raja Peters de Banacassi, whose residence was not more than 3/4 of a league from Kupang. Peters, then 80 years of age, must have been a remarkably fine man. He gave them an audience surrounded by his attendants, who treated him with profound respect, and among whom were conspicuous several warriors of gigantic stature. The dwelling that served for the royal palace was rudely constructed, yet the French travellers saw with lively surprise that articles of luxury were plentiful, and they observed also some muskets of good manufacture and great value. Notwithstanding the excessive heat of the climate, the thermometer rising in the open air to 45 degrees, and in the shade to 33 degrees, and even to 35 degrees, the commander and his officers carried on with unremitting zeal the observations and surveys which it was the object of the expedition to make. A few fell victims to their own imprudence, for in defiance of the earnest warnings of Freycinet, some of the young officers and the seamen chose to sally forth in the middle of the day, and with the view of fortifying themselves against the injurious effects of their dangerous freak, drank and ate plentifully of cold water and sour fruits. The result was that in a short time 5 of the most imprudent were confined to their hammocks with dysentery. This necessitated a departure from Timor, so the Uranie weighed anchor and set sail on the 23rd October. At first the corvette sailed rapidly along the north coast of Timor, for the purpose of making a survey, but when she had reached the narrowest part of the channel of Ambay, she encountered such violent currents that, the winds being slight and contrary, it was only with great difficulty she was able to regain the course which she had lost during the calm. No less than 19 days were wasted in this trying situation, though certain of the officers took advantage of the delay to land on the nearest point of the island of Ambay, where the coast had a very inviting appearance. They went on shore near a village called Baitauka, and advanced to meet a body of the natives, armed with shields and cuirasses made of buffalo skin, and carrying bows, arrows, and daggers. Savages though they were, they had quite the air of warriors, and were not at all afraid of firearms. On the contrary, they argued that the loading of the gun caused loss of time, for while that operation was going on, they could fire off a great number of arrows. Gaimard writes, the points of the arrows were of hard wood, or of bone, and some of iron. The arrows themselves, displayed fan-wise, were fastened on the left side of the warrior to the belt of his sword or dagger. Most of these people wore bundles of palm leaves, slit so as to allow red or black-coloured strips of the same to be passed through to hold them together, which were attached to the belt or the right thigh. The rustling sound produced with every movement of the wearers of this singular ornament, increased by knocking against the cuirass or the buckler, with the addition of the tinkling of little bells, which also formed part of the warrior's equipment, altogether made such a jumble of discordant sounds that we could not refrain from laughing. Far from taking offence, our Ambayan friends joined heartily in our merriment. Arago one greatly excited their astonishment by performing some sleight-of-hand tricks. We then took our way straight to the village of Baitauka, which was situated on a rising ground. In passing one of their cottages we happened to see about a score of human jawbones suspended from the roof, and anxious to get possession of one or two, I offered the most valuable articles I had about me in exchange. The answer was, Palami, they are sacred. We ascertained afterwards that these were the jawbones of their enemies, preserved as trophies of victory. One Jacques Arago, brother of the illustrious astronomer. Warriors of Ambay and Gebay, Warriors of Ambe and Gebe. Facsimile of early engraving. This excursion derived greater interest from the circumstance of the island of Ambe having been up to that time rarely visited by Europeans, and the few vessels that had effected any landing brought mournful accounts of the warlike and ferocious temper of the natives, and even in some instances of their cannibal propensities. Thus, in 1802 the merchant ship Rose had her small boat carried off, and the crew were detained as prisoners by the savages. 10 years later, the captain of the ship Inacho, who landed by himself, received several arrow wounds. Again, in 1817, an English frigate sent the cutter ashore for the purpose of getting wood, when a scrimmage took place between the crew and the natives, which ended in the former being killed and eaten. The day after, an armed sloop was dispatched in quest of the missing crew, but nothing was found save some fragments of the cutter and the bloody remains of the unfortunate men. In view of these facts, the French travellers must be congratulated on having escaped being entrapped by the savage cannibals, which would undoubtedly have been attempted had the Uranie stayed long enough at Ambe. On the 17th of November, the anchor was let go at Dili. After the customary interchange of compliments with the Portuguese governor, Freycinet made known the requirements of the expedition, and received a friendly assurance that the necessary provisions should be instantly forthcoming. The reception given to all the members of the expedition was both hearty and liberal, and when Freycinet took his leave, the governor, wishing that he should carry away some souvenir of his visit, presented him with 2 boys and 2 girls, of the ages of 6 and 7, natives of Failaka, a kingdom in the interior of Timor. To ensure the acceptance of this present, the governor, D. José Pinto Alcafarado de Vado y Souza, stated that the race to which the children belonged was quite unknown in Europe. In spite of all the strong and conclusive reasons that Freycinet gave to explain why he felt compelled to decline the present, he was obliged to take charge of one of the little boys, who subsequently received the name of Joseph Antonio in baptism, but when 16 years old died of some scrofulous disease at Paris. On a first examination, it would appear that the population of Timor belonged altogether to the Asiatic race, but so far as any reliance can be placed upon somewhat extended researches, there is reason to think that in the unfrequented mountains in the center of the island there exists a race of Negroes with woolly hair and savage manners, of the type of the indigenous races of New Guinea and New Ireland, whom one is led to consider the primitive population. This line of research, commenced at the close of the 18th century by an Englishman of the name of Crawford, has been in our time carried forward with striking results by the labours of the learned doctors Broca and E. Hamey, to the latter of whom the reading public are indebted for the pleasing and instructive papers on primitive populations which have appeared in Nature and in the journals of the Royal Geographical Society. After leaving Timor, the Uranie proceeded towards the Strait of Beru, and in passing between the islands of Wetter and Roma, got sight of the picturesque island of Gases, clothed in the brightest and thickest verdure imaginable. The corvette was then drifted by currents almost as far as the island of Pisang, near which she fell in with 3 dhows, manned by natives of the island of Gebe. These people have an olive complexion, broad flat noses and thick lips. Some are strong, looking robust and athletic, others are slender and weakly in appearance, and others, again, thick-set and repulsive-looking. The only clothing worn by the majority at this time was a pair of drawers fastened with a handkerchief round the waist. A landing was effected on the little island of Pisang. It was found to be of volcanic origin, and the soil, formed from the decomposition of trachytic lava, was evidently very fertile. From Pisang the corvette made her way among islands, till then scarcely known, to Rawak, where she cast anchor at noon on the 16th of December. This island, though small, is inhabited, but though our navigators were often visited by the natives of Waigiu, opportunities for studying this species of the human family have been rare. Moreover, it ought to be mentioned that through ignorance of the language of the indigenous tribes, and the difficulty of making them understand through the medium of Malayan, of which they know only a few words, even those few opportunities have not been turned to much account. As soon as a suitable position was found, the instruments were set up, and the usual physical and astronomical observations were made in conjunction with geographical researches. Rewek hut on piles. Rewek hut on piles. Facsimile of early engraving. The islands which Freycinet calls the islands of the Papuans are Rawak, Boni, Waigiu and Manaran, which are situated almost immediately below the equator. The largest of these, Waigiu, is not less than 72 miles from one side to the other. The low shorage consists mainly of swamp and morass, while the banks, which run up steeply, are surrounded by coral reefs, and are full of small caves hollowed out by the waves. All the islets are clothed with vegetation of surprising beauty. They abound with magnificent trees, amongst which the Barringtonia may be recognized, with its voluminous trunk always leaning towards the sea, allowing the tips of the branches to touch the water. The Scovola lobelia, fig trees, mangroves, the casuarinae, with their straight and slender stems shooting up to the height of 40 feet. The Rima, the Takanahaka, with its trunk more than 20 feet in circumference. The Cynometa, belonging to the family of leguminous plants, bright from its topmost to its lowest branches with pale red flowers and golden fruits. And besides these rarer trees, palms, nutmeg trees, rose-apple trees, banana trees, flourish in the low and moist ground. The luxuriant vegetation of the Papuan Islands. The luxuriant vegetation of the Papuan Islands. The fauna, however, has not attained to the same exceptionally fine development as the flora. At Rawak the phalanger and the sheepdog in a wild state were the only quadrupeds met with. In Waigiu, the boar called Barbarossa and a diminutive of the same race were found, but as to the feathered tribe, they were not so numerous as one might have supposed. The plants yielding grain necessary for the sustenance of birds not being able to thrive in the dense shade of the forests. Hornbills are here met with, whose wings, furnished with long feathers separated at the tips, make a very loud noise when they fly. Great quantities of parrots, kingfishers, turtle doves, piping crows, brown hawks, crested pigeons, and possibly also birds of paradise, though the travellers did not see any specimens. The Papuans themselves are positively repulsively ugly. To quote the words of Audit Pelion, a flat skull, a facial angle of 75 degrees, a large mouth, eyes small and sunken, a thick nose, flat at the end and pressed down on the upper lip, a scanty beard, a peculiarity of the people of those regions already noticed, shoulders of a moderate size, a prominent belly and slight lower limbs. These are the chief characteristics of the Papuans. Their hair, both in its nature and mode of arrangement, varies a good deal. Most commonly it is dressed with great pains into a matted structure not less than 8 inches in height, composed of a mass of soft downy hair curling naturally, or it is frizzed up, till it positively bristles, and with the assistance of a coating of grease, is plastered round the skull in the shape of a globe. A long wooden comb of 6 or 7 teeth is also often stuck in, not so much to aid in keeping the mass together as to give a finishing touch of ornament. These unfortunate people are afflicted with the terrible scourge of leprosy, which is so prevalent that at least a 10th part of the population are infested with the disease. The cause of this dreadful malady must be sought in the insalubrity of the climate, the miasma from the marshes, which are overflowed with sea-water every flood tide, the neighbourhood of the burial places, which are badly kept, and perhaps also to the consumption of shellfish which these natives devour greedily. All the houses, whether inland or on the coast, are built on piles. Many of these dwellings are erected in places extremely difficult of access. They are made by thrusting stakes into the earth, to which transverse beams are fastened with ropes made of fibre, and on these a flooring is laid of palm leaves, trimmed and strongly intertwined one with another. These leaves, made to lap over in an artistic fashion, are also used for the roof of the house, which has only one door. Should the dwellings be built over the water, communication is carried on between them and the shore by means of a kind of bridge resting upon trestles, the movable flooring of which can be quickly taken up. Every house is also surrounded by a kind of balcony furnished with a balustrade. The travellers could not obtain any information as to the friendly disposition of these natives, whether the whole tribe consists of large communities united under one chief or several, whether each community obeys only its own proper head, whether the population is numerous or not, are all points which could not be ascertained. The name by which they call themselves is Ulfuras. They appeared to talk in several distinct dialects, which differ remarkably from Papuan or Malay. The inhabitants of this group seem to be a very industrious race. They manufacture all sorts of fishing apparatus very cleverly. They are expert in finding their way through the forests. They know how to prepare the pith of the sago plant, and to make ovens for the cooking of the sago. They can turn pottery ware, weave mats, carpets, baskets, and can also carve idols and figures. In the harbour of Boney on the coast of Waigiu, Quoy and Gaymard noticed a statue moulded in white clay, under a sort of canopy close to a tomb. It represented a man standing upright of the natural height, with his hands raised towards heaven. The head was of wood, with the cheeks and eyes inlaid with small pieces of white shell. Map of Australia. On the 6th of January, 1819, having taken in supplies at Rawak, the Uranie proceeded on her voyage, and soon came in sight of the Ayu Islands, mere sandbanks surrounded by breakers, of which few geographical details had been known up to that time. There was much to be done in the way of accurate survey, but unfortunately the hydrographers were sorely hindered in their work by the fever which they and some 40 of the crew had contracted at Rawak. Sailing on, the Anchoret Islands came in sight on the 12th of February, and on the day following the Amarantes, but the Uranie did not attempt to make for the land. Shortly after passing the Amarantes, the corvette sighted St. Bartholomew, which the inhabitants call Pulausauk. It belongs to the Caroline archipelago. A busy trade, always attended with much uproar, was soon set on foot with the indigenous people, who resisted all persuasion to come on board, conducting all their transactions nevertheless with admirable good faith, in no instance showing any dishonest tendencies. One after another Pulauhat, Alit, Tamatam, Alap, Tanadik, all islands belonging to this archipelago, passed before the admiring gaze of the French navigators. At length, on the 17th of March, 1819, just 18 months from the time of quitting France, Freycinet got sight of the Marian Islands, and cast anchor in the roads of Umata on the coast of Guam. Just as the officers of the expedition were ready to go on shore, the governor of the island, D. Medinilla y Pinda, accompanied by his lieutenant, Major D. Louis de Torres, came on board to bid them welcome. These gentlemen showed a polite anxiety to learn what the explorers stood in need of, and engaged that all their wants should be supplied with the least possible delay. No time was lost in looking for a place suited for conversion into a temporary hospital, and one being found, the sick on board, to the number of 20, were removed to it for treatment the very next day. A dinner to the staff of the expedition was given by the governor, and all the officers assembled in his house at the appointed hour. They found a table covered with light cakes and fruits, in the midst of which were 2 bowls of hot punch. Some surprise escaped the guests, in private remarks to one another, at this singular kind of banquet. Could it be a fast day? Why did no one sit down? But as there was no interpreter to clear up these points, and as it would have been unbecoming to ask for an explanation, they kept their difficulties for solution among themselves, and paid attention to the good things before them. Soon a fresh surprise came. The table was cleared and covered with various sorts of prepared dishes. In short, a substantial and sumptuous dinner was served. The collation which had been taken at the commencement, called in the language of the country, refresco, had been intended only to whet the appetites of the guests for what was to follow. After this, luxurious dinners became quite the rage at Guam. 2 days subsequent to the governor's banquet, the officers found themselves at a dinner party of 50 guests, where no less than 44 separate dishes were served at each of the 3 courses of which the dinner consisted. Freycinet, from information he had received, relates that this dinner cost the lives of 2 oxen and 3 fat pigs, to say nothing of poultry, game, and fish. Such a slaughter, I should think, has not been known since the marriage feast of Gamash. No doubt our host considered that persons who had undergone so many privations during a protracted voyage ought to be compensated with an unusually profuse entertainment. The dessert showed no falling off either in abundance or in variety. It was succeeded by tea, coffee, creams, liqueurs of every description, and as the refresco had been served as usual an hour previous to dinner, it will be admitted without question that at Guam the most intrepid gourmand could find no other cause for disappointment but the limited capacity of the human stomach. However, the objects of the mission were not interfered with by all this dining and festivity. Natural history excursions, magnetical observations, the geographical survey of the island of Guam, entrusted to Duperrey, were all being pushed forward simultaneously. But in the meantime the corvette had got to moorings in the deep water off the port of St. Louis, while the chief of the staff as well as the sick were housed at Agagna, the capital of the island and the seat of government. At that place, in honour of the French visitors, cockfights took place, a kind of sport very popular in all the Spanish possessions in Oceania. Dances also were given, the figures in which, it was said, contained allusions to events in the history of Mexico. The dancers, students of the Agagna College, were dressed in rich silks, imported a long time previously by the Jesuits from New Spain. Then came combats with sticks in which the Carolines took part, which again were succeeded, almost uninterruptedly, by other amusements. But what Freycinet considered of most value was the mass of information concerning the customs and manners of the former inhabitants of the islands, which he obtained through Major D. Louis Torres, who, himself born in the country, had made a constant study of this subject. Of this interesting information use will be made when the subject is presently resumed, but first some notice must be taken of an excursion to the islands Rota and Tinian, the latter of which had already become known to us through the narratives of former travellers. A performer of the dances of Montezuma. A performer of the dances of Montezuma. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 22nd April, a small fleet of 8 prowess conveyed Berard, Gaudichaud, and Jacques Arago to Rota, where their arrival occasioned great surprise and alarm, explained by the fact that a report had gained currency in the island that the corvette was manned with rebels from America. Beyond Rota, the prowess reached Tinian, where the arid plains recalled to the travellers the desolate coasts of the land of Indracht, testifying to the considerable changes that must have taken place there since the time when Lord Anson described the place as a terrestrial paradise. The Marian Archipelago was discovered by Magellan on the 6th March, 1521, and at first received the name of Islas de las Villas Latinas, the Isles of the Latin Sails, but subsequently that of the Ladrones or the Robbers. If one may trust Pigafetta, the illustrious admiral saw no islands but Tinian, Saipan, and Agagnan. 5 years later they were visited by the Spaniard Loyasa, whose cordial reception was quite a contrast to that of Magellan, and in 1565 the islands were declared to be Spanish territory by Miguel López de Legazpi. It was not, however, that they were colonized and evangelized by Father Sanvitors. It will be understood that we should not follow Freycinet's narrative of past events in the history of this archipelago, were it not that the manuscripts and works of every kind which he was permitted to consult enabled him to treat the subject de novo, and throw upon it the light of real knowledge. The admiration, still lingering in the minds of the travellers, which had been aroused by the incredible fertility of the Papuan Islands, and the Moluccas was no doubt calculated to weaken the impression produced by any of the Marian Islands. The forests of Guam, though well stocked, did not present the gigantic appearance common to forest scenery in the tropics. They extended over a large part of the island, yet there were also immense spaces devoted to pasturage, where not a breadfruit tree nor a coconut palm was to be seen. In the depths of the forests, moreover, the conquerors of the islands had created artificial glades, in order that the herds of horned cattle which they had introduced might find food, and also enjoy shelter from the sun. Agagnan, an island with a very rocky coast, presented from a distance an arid and barren appearance, but is in reality thickly clothed with trees, even to the summit of its highest mountains. Rota is a regular jungle, an almost impenetrable mass of brushwood, above which rise thickets of remas, tamarind, fig, and palm trees. Tinian, too, presents anything but an agreeable appearance. The French explorers altogether missed the charming scenes described in such glowing colours by their predecessors, but the appearance of the soil, and the immense number of dead trees, led them to the conclusion that old accounts were not altogether exaggerated, especially as the southern portion of the island is now rendered quite inaccessible by its dense forests. At the time of Freycinet's visit the population of these islands was of a very mixed character, the aborigines being quite in the minority. The more highly born of the natives were formerly bigger, stronger, and better made than Europeans, but the race is degenerating, and the primitive type in its purity is now only to be met with in Rota. Capital swimmers and divers, able to walk immense distances without fatigue, every man of them had to prove his proficiency in these exercises on his marriage. But although this proficiency has been in some measure kept up, the leading characteristic of the people of the Marian group is idleness, or perhaps to be more strictly accurate, indifference. Marriages are contracted at a very early age, the bridegroom being generally between 15 and 18, the bride between 12 and 15. A numerous progeny is the result of these unions, instances being on record of 22 children born of one mother. Not only do the people of Guam suffer from many diseases, such as lung complaints, smallpox, and C, introduced by Europeans, but also from some which seem to be endemic, or in any case to have assumed a type peculiar to the place and altogether abnormal. Such are elephantiasis and leprosy, 3 varieties of which are met with at Guam, differing from each other alike in their symptoms and their effects. Before the conquest, the people of the Marians lived on the fruit of the rema or bread tree, rice, sago, and other farinaceous plants. Their mode of cooking these articles was extremely simple, though not so much so as their style of dress, for they went about in a state of nature, unrelieved even by the traditional fig leaf. At the present time children still wear no clothing till they are about 10 years old. Alluding to this peculiar custom, Captain Pages, writing at the close of last century, says, "I found myself near a house, in front of which an Indian girl, about 11 years old, was squatted on her heels in the full blaze of the sun, without a vestige of clothing on. Her chemise lay folded on the ground in front of her. When she saw me approaching, she got up quickly and put it on again. Although still far from decently clothed, for only her shoulders were covered by it, she now considered herself properly dressed, and stood before me quite unembarrassed. Judging from the remains nearly everywhere to be met with, such as the ruins of dwellings originally supported by masonry pillars, it is plain that the population was formerly considerable. The earliest traveller who has made any reference to this subject is Lord Anson. He has given a somewhat fanciful description, which, however, the explorers in the Uranie were able to corroborate, as will be seen from the following extract. The description found in the narrative of Lord Anson's voyage is correct, but the ruins and the branches of the trees that have in some way twined themselves about the masonry pillars wear now a very different aspect from what they did in his time. The sharp edges of the pillars have got rubbed away, and the half-globes that surmounted them have no longer their former roundness. Ruins of ancient pillars at Tinian. Ruins of ancient pillars at Tinian. Facsimile of early engraving. Of the structures of more recent date only a sixth part are of stone. At Agagna may be counted several buildings possessing some interest on account of their size, if not on that of their elegance, grandeur, or the fineness of their proportions. These are the College of St. John Lateran, the church, the clergy house, the governor's palace, and the taverns. Before the Spaniards established their sway in these islands, the natives were divided into three classes: the nobility, the inferior nobility, and the commonalty. These last, the pariahs of the country, Freycinet remarks, though without citing his authority, were of a more diminutive stature than the other inhabitants. This difference of height is, however, scarcely a sufficient reason for pronouncing them to be of a different race from the other two classes. Is it not more reasonable to conclude it to be the result of the degrading servitude to which they have been subjected? These plebeians could under no circumstances raise themselves to a higher class, and a seafaring life was forbidden to them. Each of the three castes had its own sorceresses and priestesses, or medicine women, who each devoted her attention to the treatment of some one disorder, only no reason, however, for crediting them with any special skill in its cure. The business of canoe building was monopolized by the nobles, who, however, allowed the inferior nobles to assist in their construction. The making of canoes was to them a work of the utmost importance, and the nobles maintained it as one of their most valuable privileges. The language spoken in the Philippine group, though it has some affinity with the Malay and Tagala dialects, has all the same a distinctive character of its own. Freycinet's narrative also contains much information on the extremely singular customs of the former population of the Marians, which are beyond our province, though well worthy of the attention of the philosopher and historian. The Uranie had been now more than 2 months at anchor. It was full time to resume the work of exploration. Freycinet and his staff, therefore, devoted the few remaining days of their stay to the task of paying farewell visits and expressing their gratitude for the hearty kindness which had been so profusely shown to them. The governor, however, not only declined to admit his claim to thanks from the French travellers for the hospitable attentions heaped upon them for upwards of 2 months, but also refused to accept any payment for the supplies which had been furnished for the refitting of the corvette. He even went so far as to write a letter of apology for the scantiness of the provisions, the result of the drought which had desolated Guam for the previous 6 months, and which had prevented him from doing things as he could have wished. The final farewell took place off Agagna. It was impossible, says Freycinet, to take leave of the amiable man, who had loaded us with so many proofs of his friendly disposition, without being deeply affected. I was too much moved to be able to find expression for the feelings with which my heart was filled, but the tears which filled my eyes must have been to him a surer evidence than any words could have been of my gratitude and my regret. From the 5th to the 16th June, the Uranie occupied in an exploring cruise round the north of the Marian Islands, in the course of which were made the observations of which the substance has been given above. The commander, wishing to make a quick passage to the Sandwich Islands, then took advantage of a breeze to gain a higher latitude, where he hoped to meet with favourable winds. But as the explorers penetrated further and further into this part of the Pacific Ocean, cold and dense fogs wrapped them round, permeating the whole vessel with damp, equally unpleasant and injurious to health. However, the crew suffered no worse inconvenience than slight colds. In fact, the change had rather a bracing effect than otherwise on men now for some time accustomed to the enervating heat of the tropics. On the 6th August the south point of Hawaii was doubled, and Freycinet made for the western side of the island, where he hoped to find a safe and convenient anchorage. A dead calm prevailing, the first and second days were spent in opening relations with the natives. The women came off in crowds immediately on the arrival of the ship, with the view of carrying on their usual trade, but the commander laid an interdict on their coming on board. The first piece of news given to the captain by one of the Ariwa was that King Kamehameha was dead, and that his young son Rio had succeeded him. Taking advantage of a change of wind, the Uranie sailed on to the Bay of Karakakoa, and Freycinet was about to send an officer in advance to take soundings, when a canoe put off from the shore, having on board the governor of the island, Prince Korkini, otherwise John Adams, 3 who promised the captain that he would find boats suitable for the taking of the necessary supplies to the corvette. This young man, about 9 and 20 years of age, almost a giant in stature, but well-proportioned, surprised Freycinet by the extent of his information. On being informed that the corvette was on a voyage of discovery, he inquired, "Have you doubled Cape Horn, or did you come round the Cape of Good Hope?" He then asked for the latest information about Napoleon, and wished to know whether it was true that the island of St. Helena had been swallowed up with all its inhabitants, a story he had evidently heard from some facetious whalemen, but had not entirely believed. See previous footnote. 3. It was the custom for the chiefs in these parts to assume new names, often for the most trifling reasons. Trans. Korkini next apprised Freycinet that though actual disturbances had not broken out on the death of Kamehameha, yet that some of the chiefs having asserted claims to independence, the stability of the monarchy was in some danger. As a result, the political situation was strained, and the government was in some perplexity, a state of things which probably would soon terminate, especially if the commandant would consent to make some declaration in favor of the youthful sovereign. Freycinet landed with the prince, to pay him a return visit, and on entering his house was introduced to his wife, a very corpulent woman, who was lying on a European bedstead covered with matting. After this visit, the captain and his host went to visit the widows of Kamehameha, the prince's sisters, but not being able to see them, they proceeded to the yards and workshops of the deceased king. Here were 4 sheds sacred to the building of large war canoes, and others containing European boats. Farther on was seen wood for building purposes, bars of copper, quantities of fishing nets, a forge, a cooper's workshop, and lastly, some cases belonging to the Prime Minister, Kremaku, filled with all necessary appliances for navigation, such as compasses, sextants, thermometers, watches, and even a chronometer. Strangers were not allowed to inspect 2 other magazines in which were stored powder and other war materials, strong liquors, iron, and see all these places were for the present abandoned by the new sovereign, who held his court at Koihai Bay. Freycinet, on receiving an invitation from the king, made ready to visit him there, under the guidance of a native pilot who showed himself most attentive, and was very skillful in forecasting the weather. "The monarch," writes Freycinet, "was waiting for me on the beach, dressed in the full uniform of an English captain, and surrounded by the whole of his suite. In spite of the terrible barrenness of this side of the island, the spectacle of the grotesque assemblage of men and women was not without grandeur and beauty. The king himself stood in front with his principal officers a little distance behind him, some wearing splendid mantles made of red or yellow feathers, or of scarlet cloth, others in short tippets of the same kind, but in which the 2 glaring colours were relieved with black. A few had helmets on their heads. This striking picture was further diversified by a number of soldiers grouped here and there, and clad in various and strange costumes. The sovereign now under notice was the same, who, with his young and charming wife, undertook at a later period a voyage to England, where they both died. Their remains were brought back to Hawaii by Captain Byron in the frigate La Blonde. Freycinet seized this opportunity to repeat his request for supplies of fresh provisions, and the king promised that 2 days should not pass before his wishes should be fully complied with. However, although the good faith of the young monarch was above suspicion, the commander soon discovered that most of the chiefs had no intention of obeying their sovereign's orders. Some little time after this, the principal officers of the staff went to pay a visit to the widows of Kamehameha. The following amusing description of their lively reception is given by M. Coy. "A strange spectacle," he says, "met our view on our entrance into an apartment of narrow dimensions, where 8 lumps of half-naked humanity lay on the ground with their faces downwards. It was not an easy task to find space to lay ourselves down according to custom in the same manner. The attendants were constantly on the move, some carrying fans made of feathers to whisk away the flies, another a lighted pipe which was passed from one prostrate figure to another, each taking a whiff or 2, while the rest were engaged in shampooing the royal personages. Conversation, it may readily be imagined, was not well maintained under these trying circumstances, and had it not been for some excellent watermelons which were handed to us, the tedium of the interview would have been insupportable. Freycinet next went to pay a visit to the famous John Young, who had been for so long a time the faithful friend and sagacious adviser of King Kamehameha. Although he was then old and in bad health, he was not the less able to supply Freycinet with some valuable information about the Sandwich Islands, where he had lived for 30 years, and in the history of which he had played a prominent part. Crémacu, the minister, during a visit which he was paying on board the Uranie, had caught sight of the Abbé de Quellin, the chaplain, whose costume puzzled him a good deal. As soon as he had learned that the strangely dressed person was a priest, he expressed to the commandant a desire to receive baptism. His mother, he said, had been admitted to that sacrament upon her deathbed, and she had obtained from him a promise to submit himself to the same ceremony as soon as he met with a convenient opportunity. Freycinet gave his consent, and endeavoured to make the proceeding as solemn as possible, all the more because Rio requested permission to be present at it with all his suite. Every one behaved with the utmost decorum and reverence while the ceremony was taking place, but immediately on its close there was a general rush to the collation which the commandant had ordered to be prepared. It was wonderful to see how rapidly the bottles of wine and the flasks of rum and of brandy were emptied, and to witness the speedy disappearance of the viands with which the table had been covered. Fortunately the day was coming to a close, or Rio, and the majority of his officers and courtiers would not have been in a condition to reach the shore. In spite of this, however, it was necessary to comply with his request for 2 additional bottles of brandy, that he might, as he said, drink the health of the commander and success to his voyage, a request which all his attendants felt bound in politeness to make likewise. It is not an overstatement, observes Freycinet, to say that in the short space of 2 hours our distinguished guests drank and carried away what would have been sufficient to supply the wants of 10 ordinary persons for 3 months. Several presents had been exchanged between the royal pair and the commander. Among those made by the young queen was a cloak of feathers, a kind of garment which had become exceedingly scarce in the Sandwich Islands. Freycinet was about to set sail again, when he learnt from an American captain that a merchant vessel was lying off the island of Mio, having a large quantity of biscuit and rice on board, which there was no doubt might be purchased. This information determined Freycinet to anchor first off Rahina, among other reasons, because it was there that Crémacu had undertaken to deliver a number of pigs, which were required for the use of the crew. But the minister displayed signal bad faith in the transaction. He tendered miserably poor pigs, and demanded an extravagantly high price, so that it was necessary to have recourse to threats before the business could be satisfactorily arranged. In this matter Crémacu was under the misguidance of an English runaway convict from Port Jackson, and most probably had the native been left to obey the promptings of his own nature, he would have acted on this occasion with the good faith and the sense of honour which were his usual characteristics. On reaching the island of Oahu, Freycinet dropped anchor off Honolulu. The hearty welcome he received from the European residents made him regret that he had not come here direct to begin with, for he was able without any delay to procure all the supplies which he had found so much difficulty in getting together at the 2 other islands. Boki, the governor of Oahu, received baptism from the chaplain of the Uranie. He was prompted apparently by no other motive than a wish to do as his brother had done, who had previously received this sacrament. He was far from having the air of intelligence common to the other natives of the various islands of the Sandwich group hitherto visited. Many observations on these natives are made in the narrative of the expedition, which are too interesting to be passed over without a brief summary here. All navigators are agreed in considering that the class of chiefs belong to a race excelling the other inhabitants, both in intelligence and in stature. It is very unusual to find one who is less than 6 feet in height. Obesity is very common, but chiefly among the women, who while still quite young often become enormously corpulent. The Sandwich type is strongly marked and distinct. Pretty women are numerous, but the blessing of length of days is seldom enjoyed. An old man of 70 is a rare phenomenon. This early decline and premature death must be ascribed to the persistent dissipation in which the people pass their lives. On leaving the Sandwich Islands, Freycinet found it necessary to notice carefully the curves of the magnetic equator in low latitudes, for accordingly, he crowded all sail in an easterly direction. On the 7th October the Uranie entered the southern hemisphere, and on the 19th of the same month the dangerous islands came in sight. To the eastward of the navigator's archipelago, an island was discovered, not marked on the charts, which was named Rose, after Madame Freycinet. This was the only actual discovery of the voyage.